The dust devil spiraled across the endless prairie, carrying with it the acrid scent of sage and something far more sinister, the metallic tang of spilled blood that clung to the scorching air like a curse. 8-year-old Adele pressed herself against the trembling flank of the white mare. Her small fingers twisted desperately in the animal's coarse mane as it whinnied and sidled in terror, spooked by the thunderous approach of riders whose intentions needed no explanation in this lawless territory. Kaya crouched beside them, both his weathered hands moving with practiced precision along the worn neck of a parlor guitar. The Apache warrior's unwavering look tracked the dust cloud rising from the eastern ridge, while his battle-tested fingers found the instrument's lowest string, pressing it against the wooden fret with the kind of deliberate care that came from years of understanding how sound could mean the difference between life and death. The deep, resonant vibration that emerged wasn't music in any conventional sense. It was something older, more fundamental. A low note that seemed to steady the mare without a word, promising calm in a world suddenly gone mad with violence, and the promise of worse to come. The mare's ears flicked forward, then back again, her rolling eyes beginning to settle as the bass note thrummed through the heated air. Kaya had discovered this technique during his years as a cavalry scout, back before the jagged scar on his left calf and the bitter knowledge that trust was a luxury few could afford in this brutal country. Low, steady notes calmed panicked horses better than any human voice. And in a land where silence often meant survival, a quiet mount could be worth more than gold. The sharp crack of a rifle split the afternoon stillness like lightning splitting bone. Splinters of wood exploded near Kaya's shoulder as the bullet screamed past the guitar's carved headstock, gouging a smoking furrow in the hardpan earth behind him. Without hesitation, he rolled his lean body over Adele, pressing her face into the mare's sweat-dampened neck, while his free hand found the Winchester rifle propped against a weathered boulder. "Stay down, little sparrow," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd watched too many children learn too young that the world held more fangs than mercy. The rifle's stock kicked against his shoulder as he returned fire, the report echoing across the grassland like thunder. One of the approaching riders, a scarecrow-thin man with a yellow bandana knotted around his throat, pitched sideways from his saddle with a strangled cry, his horse continuing the charge for 3 more frantic strides before wheeling away in equine confusion. The remaining bandits hauled back on their reins, their mounts rearing and fighting the cruel bits as dust swirled around them, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Even at this distance, Kaya could make out their leader, a thick-bodied man, with a nose that had been broken so many times it resembled a twisted root. Malcolm Crooked Miles McKenna, they called him in the settlements. A man who killed as casually as most folks drew breath and took considerably more pleasure in the act. "That's far enough, Apache dog." Malcolm's gravelly voice carried on the wind like a threat carved from stone. "You got teeth, I'll give you that. But we'll be back when the moon's dark and you can't see us coming." They spurred their horses hard toward the northern hills, leaving behind only hoof prints pressed deep in the alkaline soil, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the superheated air like incense at a devil's altar. From her concealed position on the ridge above, Louisa Whitmore watched the entire deadly tableau unfold through a gap in the red sandstone, her heart hammering against her ribs with the frantic rhythm of a war drum. She kept both her well-worn Colt revolvers cocked and ready, though her hands trembled not from fear, which had become as familiar as breathing in this territory, but from the sheer impossibility of what she'd just witnessed. An Apache warrior, playing a guitar, protecting her ward with his own body. The contradiction struck at the very foundation of everything she'd been taught to believe. Every story she'd heard, every warning passed down from those who claimed to know the true nature of the Apache, had painted them as merciless killers who took no prisoners and showed no mercy. Yet here was one of them risking his life to shield a white child from harm using music instead of violence as his first response to her terror. Louisa had been tracking Malcolm's murderous gang for the better part of a week, ever since they'd ambushed her supply wagon and scattered her precious seed grain across the mining road like chaff in a windstorm. She'd expected to find Adele's small body by now, stripped and left for the buzzards like so many others who'd crossed paths with Crooked Miles and his band of killers. Instead, she found this scene that defied every story she'd ever heard about Apache raiders and their supposed bloodthirsty nature. The warrior below helped Adele to her feet with surprising gentleness, his experienced hands guiding her small palm to the mare's velvety muzzle. The child's terrified sobs quieted as the horse lowered its massive head, allowing her to stroke the white blaze between its dark eyes, with the wonder of someone discovering that kindness could exist even in hell. Louisa's breath caught in her throat, like a prayer she'd forgotten how to finish. This Apache had saved Adele's life, and quite possibly her own. But trust was a commodity she'd learned to hoard like gold since her husband Thomas's death the previous winter, when fever had claimed him, despite all her desperate prayers and Doc Huxley's best efforts. Too many predators in this territory wore the masks of saviors, and she'd buried too many hopes beneath the unforgiving prairie soil to risk her heart or Adele's life on appearances. The war between her lifelong prejudices and the evidence before her eyes raged in her chest like fever. Every instinct screamed warnings about Apache treachery, about the stories of white families found butchered in their homes. But those same instincts couldn't explain why this warrior had chosen to protect rather than harm, why he'd used music to calm fear instead of adding to it. Still, the immediate danger blazed clear as mountain air. Malcolm's gang would return by nightfall, probably with reinforcements recruited from the desperate men who haunted the mining camps and cattle towns. Whatever game this Apache was playing, whatever hidden agenda might be driving his actions, one fact remained as undeniable as the sun overhead. He was the only thing standing between them and a shallow grave carved in the hardpan. Louisa made her choice with the swift decisiveness that frontier life demanded, but her hands still shook as she began her descent. Not from fear of the Apache warrior below, she realized with surprise, but from the weight of abandoning beliefs that had shaped her understanding of the world for nearly 3 decades. Slowly, she rose from her rocky hiding place and began picking her way down the treacherous slope, her weapon still drawn, but no longer aimed with killing intent. The Apache's head turned toward her movement before she'd taken 3 careful steps, those alert eyes cataloging her approach with the cold efficiency of a predator evaluating potential threats. But he made no move toward his rifle. Instead, he shifted slightly to one side, positioning himself between Louisa and Adele, in a gesture that spoke of protection rather than aggression. As Kaya watched the white woman descend the rocky slope, he found himself adjusting his initial assessment of the situation. This wasn't a settler militia member or a cavalry scout, and the tension in her movements spoke of maternal desperation rather than military aggression. Her weapons were held ready but not aimed, suggesting someone prepared for violence, but hoping to avoid it. More importantly, the child had shown no fear of him, which meant this woman had raised her with more wisdom than most whites possessed about the Apache people. "Ma'am," he said simply, his English precise and unaccented, carrying none of the broken grammar she'd expected. "Your girl is safe." Louisa's experienced gaze swept over the scene, the splintered rock where the bullet had struck close enough to draw blood, the guitar still clutched protectively in one weathered hand, and the careful way Adele leaned against the warrior's buckskin-clad leg without the slightest trace of fear. The evidence painted a picture her lifelong prejudices hadn't prepared her to interpret. "Why?" The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, carrying with it all her confusion and desperate hope. Kaya's focused stare never wavered from her face. "Because she's just a child. and children deserve better than what men like Malcolm offer this world. The setting sun painted the western sky, the color of fresh arterial blood, and somewhere in the gathering distance, a coyote's lonely howl drifted on the evening breeze, like a lament for the innocent. Louisa holstered her weapons with deliberate care and walked forward to claim her ward. But in the back of her mind, a single thought echoed like a prayer, whispered in an empty church. Heaven help us all, because the real fight hasn't even begun. 3 days earlier, the world had seemed simpler, still dangerous, certainly for the frontier, offered no guarantees to anyone foolish enough to call it home. But at least the threats had possessed a certain predictable quality. Drought that could break a family's back in a single season. Disease that swept through settlements like wildfire through dry grass. The constant grinding struggle to coax sustenance from soil that seemed determined to produce nothing but stones and heartbreak. Louisa had been loading precious seed sacks into her weather-beaten wagon outside Garrison's general store in Prairie Rose, when the first whispers of organized trouble reached her ears. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones of cattle-baron alliances and road agents working together to drive out the small farmers' burned barns appearing overnight, like devil's signatures land claims mysteriously becoming invalid due to clerical errors that always seem to benefit the same wealthy interests. Families just disappearing in the night. Old Pete Garrison had muttered while helping her load the heavy sacks, his tobacco-stained beard wagging with each word. Their homesteads get claimed by men who never worked an honest day in their lives. Of course, the territorial authorities say they can't find hide nor hair of any wrongdoing. The corruption grew like prairie grass in this country, fast, thick, and impossible to root out once it established itself in the fertile soil of human greed. Pete's words carried the weight of personal loss. His own nephew had vanished the previous autumn, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a half-built cabin that now housed strangers who'd produced perfectly legal documentation of ownership. 50 miles to the north, Kaya of the Coyote Run Band had been following Malcolm's trail through the maze of canyons and dry washes that scarred this part of the territory, like ancient battle wounds. His reasons were intensely personal. The gang had stolen 3 horses from his people, including a pregnant mare, carrying bloodlines that stretched back to the days when the Apache ruled these plains without question or compromise. But horse theft was only part of what drove him on this solitary hunt. The gang had been growing bolder and more vicious, with each passing month hitting supply trains bound for the reservation and allowing territorial authorities to blame the Apache for crimes they'd never committed. The decision to pursue this quest alone had cost him more than he'd anticipated. His younger brother, Swift Arrow, had argued against the solitary mission, pointing out that one warrior against an organized gang was suicide disguised as justice. But Kaya's reputation as both scout and negotiator had earned him the right to choose his own path, even when that path led through territory where death waited behind every rock formation. The guitar had been his constant companion for almost a year now, wrapped in oiled canvas and secured to his saddle like a sacred relic, which in many fundamental ways, it was not sacred in the white man's Christian sense, for he'd observed enough of their church services to understand the difference. But sacred in the way that deathbed promises always were, to people who understood that a man's word might be the only thing of value he carried into the next world. He'd found the instrument in the wreckage of an overturned stagecoach near Devil's Gate, clutched in the arms of a young man with startling blue eyes and the calloused hands of someone who worked with wood and string and the patient art of making music. The stranger had been beyond any earthly help, his life bleeding out into the alkaline soil. But he'd possessed strength enough for a few whispered words that would haunt Kaya's dreams. "Take it to my sister. Prairie Rose. Promise me, please. Promise me." The young man's face had reminded Kaya of his own brother, who died in a cavalry raid years earlier, cut down while trying to protect the women and children of their band. Perhaps that resemblance had made the promise easier to give, or perhaps it was simply the recognition that dying men deserved to have their final wishes honored, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their death. The guitar itself was exquisitely crafted, built by skilled hands, by a luthier out of Carson City. Careful initials had been carved into the wood inside the sound hole OM. And despite the rough treatment it had received in the crash, the instrument showed signs of loving maintenance and regular use. Someone had treasured this guitar, had cared for it the way a warrior might care for a favorite horse or a perfectly balanced weapon. Using the instrument to calm frightened animals had been Kaya's own innovation, born from careful observation and desperate necessity. He'd noticed during his scouting days how certain sounds affected livestock and wild creatures differently. The high whine of wind through rock formations could spook a horse into blind panic, while the low rumble of distant thunder often seemed to settle them into watchful calm. The guitar's bass strings produced vibrations that seemed to speak directly to the primitive parts of an animal's brain and the ancient centers that remembered safety, comfort, and the presence of protectors rather than predators. Dr. Robert Huxley had been practicing medicine in Prairie Rose for 15 years, long enough to develop strong opinions about the kinds of men who thrived in lawless country. He'd treated the aftermath of Malcolm's negotiations before knife wounds calculated to encourage cooperation without causing immediate death, broken bones that healed crooked because their owners couldn't afford to rest long enough for proper mending burns from accidental fires that somehow always seemed to strike the farms of people who couldn't pay their debts. The pattern was always the same, a visit from Malcolm's men offering protection services that nobody wanted, but few dared refuse. Those who declined the offer found their livestock poisoned, their water sources fouled, their crops mysteriously catching fire in the middle of the night. Those who couldn't pay found themselves facing even more creative forms of persuasion. So when the Apache warrior appeared at his clinic door just after sunset, supporting a white woman and a child who looked like they'd survived their own personal apocalypse, his first instinct was to reach for the double-barreled shotgun he kept beside his medical bag for situations exactly like this one. His second instinct, trained by years of frontier medicine and the kind of pragmatic humanity that came from seeing too much suffering to waste time on prejudice, was to note the fresh blood staining the Apache's buckskin shirt and the subtle way he favored his left leg. "Doc Huxley." Louisa said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "This man saved our lives. Both of us. Can you help him?" Huxley's weathered hand moved away from the shotgun's worn grip. He'd known Louisa since Thomas's death had been present at Adele's bedside during the fever that claimed her parents had watched both woman and child struggle to build something resembling a life from the ashes of their losses. If she vouched for this Apache, that recommendation carried considerable weight in his personal ledger of trust and suspicion. "Louisa Child," he said gently, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who delivered more than his share of bad news and understood the value of kindness in dark times. "You've got the look of someone who's seen too much of the world's cruelty in too short a time. Bring him in and we'll see what kind of damage we're dealing with." The examination revealed an old cavalry scar on the warrior's left calf, a jagged souvenir from what looked like a saber cut, recently reopened and showing the first angry signs of infection that could prove fatal if left untreated. Huxley cleaned it meticulously with carbolic acid, noting how his patient endured the considerable pain without so much as a grunt of discomfort or a request for whiskey to dull the burning sensation. "What's your name, son?" he asked, while wrapping the wound with clean bandages torn from one of his dwindling supply of bed sheets. "Kaya," came the simple reply offered without elaboration or explanation. "And you're carrying that guitar because—" Huxley's curiosity was professional. as well as personal. In his experience, men didn't risk their lives carrying musical instruments unless those instruments held significance far beyond their monetary value. Kaya's alert gaze met his directly, neither challenging nor submissive, but simply honest. A promise to a dying man. His initials are carved inside the sound hole, O.M. You know anyone by those initials who might have family in Prairie Rose? Huxley's experienced hands stilled in their work. Owen Mallory, a young luthier who disappeared the previous year when his stagecoach was attacked somewhere near Devil's Gate. The boy had been full of ambitious plans to start a freight line that would compete with some of the larger, more established operators, the kind of hope and determination that this brutal country had a way of crushing under its boot heel. "I might," he said, carefully, professional caution warring with growing curiosity. "But that's a conversation for another time, when you've all had food and rest. Some things are too important to discuss when minds are clouded by exhaustion and pain." Amélie Dufour had been teaching school in Prairie Rose for 3 years, long enough to recognize the signs of serious trouble when they walked through her classroom door after hours. The Apache warrior with his carefully controlled movements, the exhausted woman with prairie dust, ground into her clothing. And the frightened child who clung to them both told a story that needed no words to convey its essential horror. She'd seen the aftermath of Malcolm's raids before the families who stumbled into town with nothing but the clothes on their backs and stark terror etched into their faces like scars. But Amélie harbored secrets of her own, carefully guarded knowledge that she'd been accumulating through months of patient observation and meticulous documentation. Her position as schoolteacher gave her access to documents that passed through many hands, legal papers that needed explanation for people who couldn't decipher the complex language themselves, shipping manifests that seemed to disappear after being filed with territorial authorities, death certificates with signatures that appeared on suspiciously large numbers of different documents. The patterns had become impossible to ignore. Too many deaths involving people who'd challenged local business interests. Too many land transfers that occurred immediately after the original owners met with accidents. Too many shipping manifests that recorded valuable cargo but somehow never reached their intended destinations. She'd begun keeping a second ledger hidden beneath the floorboards of her small quarters behind the schoolhouse, recording the patterns and discrepancies that pointed toward systematic corruption on a scale that would shock even the cynical residents of Prairie Rose if they fully understood its scope. More importantly, she'd been corresponding secretly with territorial investigators in the county seat building a case that would require overwhelming evidence to overcome the wealth and influence of those involved. "You can shelter in the schoolhouse tonight," she offered immediately, ignoring the disapproving stares from other townspeople who'd gathered to gawk at the unusual spectacle. "There's a decent stove and clean water from the well, and I can bring you food and blankets." But even as she spoke the words of welcome, her mind was working through the implications of what she was seeing. An Apache with a guitar, protecting white settlers from Malcolm's gang. Combined with the strange patterns she'd been documenting, a picture was beginning to emerge that was far more complex and sinister than simple frontier lawlessness. That night, after settling her unexpected guests in the schoolhouse, Amélie retrieved her hidden ledger and spent hours by candlelight comparing new observations with patterns she'd been tracking for months. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than she'd suspected, a systematic network of corruption that reached far beyond local officials into the territorial freight and transportation systems themselves. The connection crystallized when she cross-referenced shipping records with death certificates and land transfers. The same freight company appeared repeatedly in connection with settlements that had suffered unusual numbers of Indian raids or accidents that left valuable properties available for purchase at below-market prices. Wilbur Tate, the neighboring farmer who'd offered his spare mule, brought news that turned suspicion into certainty. Been talking to some of the other folks who've had troubles with their land deeds, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. Every one of them had dealings with the same freight company before their papers went missing or got declared invalid. Mallory Transportation out of Denver. The name hit Louisa like a physical blow. Mallory. The same surname as the initials carved inside the guitar. Owen's last name. Her family's name. The implications crashed over her like a wave of ice water, bringing with them an understanding so terrible that her mind initially refused to accept it. Her own family. Her own blood. The uncle she'd met perhaps 3 times in her life, who'd sent a polite letter of condolence when Thomas died, who'd always seemed prosperous and respectable in his expensive city clothes. Could Nathaniel really be capable of the kind of systematic evil that these patterns suggested? The next morning brought Sheriff Walter Kane and his theatrical examination of Louisa's land deed, which he promptly declared water-damaged and illegible, despite the obvious freshness of the ink used to forge the damage. The legal trap was neatly laid and completely transparent to anyone who'd been paying attention to similar cases over the past year. "Gonna need to file for a replacement at my office," Kane announced with false sympathy. "Of course, that process takes time and there's fees involved. Meanwhile, can't have folks squatting on land where the ownership's in question." As she watched the sheriff's performance, Louisa felt something harden in her chest, like cooling metal. This wasn't just about her land or her family's legacy. This was about a system of corruption that had turned law itself into a weapon against the innocent. The anger that had been simmering since Owen's letters stopped coming finally crystallized into something cold and purposeful. Amelie watched from the schoolhouse doorway, her teacher's trained eye noting details that others might miss. But it was her conversation with a traveling merchant later that day that provided the final piece of the puzzle they needed. Nathaniel Mallory himself came through here about 3 months ago, the merchant told her while watering his horses. Strange thing, though. Usually freight magnates send representatives. This one seemed real interested in talking to folks about their land titles and shipping arrangements. Asked a lot of questions about a young luthier named Owen who'd been planning some kind of competing business. The merchant paused to spit tobacco juice into the dust before continuing. Funny thing was, he didn't seem like a man conducting normal business. Had the look of someone nursing an old grudge, if you know what I mean. Made folks uncomfortable with all his personal questions about family histories and such. That evening, as Amelie shared this information with Louisa Kaya and Dr. Huxley, the terrible truth began to crystallize. Nathaniel Mallory wasn't just a businessman eliminating competition. He was Owen's own uncle, Louisa's father's younger brother, who'd built his fortune on systematic fraud and murder. "I remember him from when we were children," Louisa said, her voice hollow with growing horror. "He always resented my father's success, claimed the family business should have gone to him instead." When Owen started talking about his freight line plans in his letters, he mentioned hoping to get Uncle Nathaniel's advice and maybe even investment. Dr. Huxley leaned back in his chair, his medical training making him sensitive to the subtle signs of long-buried trauma that were now surfacing in Louisa's voice and posture. "There's more to this than business rivalry, isn't there? Something personal that goes back further than Owen's plans." The question hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. And Louisa found herself remembering details she'd tried to forget about family gatherings from her childhood. The way Nathaniel's eyes had followed her mother around the room. The barely concealed hostility he'd shown toward her father. The forced politeness that had masked something much darker and more dangerous. "Your father didn't just get the family business," Dr. Huxley said quietly, his medical training making him sensitive to the subtle signs of long-buried trauma. "There was a woman involved, wasn't there? Someone Nathaniel wanted, but who chose your father instead." Louisa's sharp intake of breath confirmed the guess. My mother. She was engaged to Nathaniel first, but she broke it off to marry my father. He never forgave either of them for that humiliation. The systematic destruction of Owen hadn't been about money or competition. It had been about revenge against a family that had wounded Nathaniel Mallory's pride decades earlier. Every death, every forged document, every stolen homestead had been payment extracted for an old debt that existed only in the twisted imagination of a man who'd let bitterness poison his soul. But worse news was already galloping toward them across the prairie. Wilbur burst into the schoolhouse just after full dark, his face pale with urgency, and his horse lathered from hard riding across dangerous country. "They're coming at first light," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath from the desperate ride. "Malcolm and his whole gang, plus some new faces I ain't seen before. Sheriff gave them some kind of legal paper eviction notice, he called it. But that ain't the worst of it." He paused to swallow hard before delivering the news that would change everything. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the water dipper, and Louisa realized that whatever he'd seen had genuinely terrified a man who'd survived 8 years of frontier hardship without breaking. "There's a fancy carriage following about an hour behind them. Driver said he was bringing someone real important to oversee the proceedings personally. Someone who wanted to make sure there weren't any witnesses left to cause trouble later." Nathaniel Mallory was coming to Prairie Rose himself to witness the final elimination of his brother's family and the completion of his decades-long campaign of vengeance. Kaya spoke from the shadows near the schoolhouse door, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions without the luxury of extended deliberation. "Town won't save you," he said with absolute certainty. "But we might be able to save each other if we move smart and fast." The escape from Prairie Rose became a desperate race against time and overwhelming odds, with Kaya, Louisa, and Adele riding hard toward the broken country south of the Ash River, where pursuit would be difficult and ambush sites plentiful. But Amelie had insisted on coming with them, bringing her documented evidence in an oilcloth-wrapped satchel that represented months of dangerous investigation. "This evidence needs to reach the territorial marshal in White Rock," she said, her schoolteacher's determination overriding her natural caution. "It's the only way to break this cycle of corruption permanently." As they prepared to leave, Louisa found herself studying Kaya's face in the pre-dawn darkness, searching for some sign of doubt or hesitation that might warn her she was making a terrible mistake. Instead, she saw only the steady competence of someone who'd faced death before and survived through skill rather than luck. The realization brought an unexpected sense of calm to her racing thoughts. For the first time since Thomas's death, she wasn't facing danger alone. Malcolm's scouts picked up their trail before the sun reached its zenith, forcing them to abandon any pretense of stealth in favor of pure speed. The chase stretched across endless miles of grassland and shallow valleys, with the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats never more than a few minutes behind, and sometimes close enough that they could hear individual voices shouting orders and curses. The first crisis came when their path led through a narrow canyon where flash flood debris had created a natural maze of boulders and fallen trees. Kaya was forced to dismount and lead the horses through on foot, his wounded leg slowing their progress, while the sound of pursuit grew steadily louder behind them. It was Louisa who solved the problem, using her knowledge of the local terrain to guide them to a hidden spring where they could water the horses and plan their next move. "There's an old prospector's trail that leads up through the rocks," she said, pointing toward what looked like an impassable cliff face. "It's treacherous, but it comes out on the far side of Devil's Creek." Watching her take charge of the navigation, Kaya found his respect for this frontier woman growing with each passing hour. She wasn't just another settler's wife struggling to survive in hostile country. She was someone who'd learned to read the land itself, to find opportunity where others saw only obstacles. The knowledge that she was capable of contributing actively to their survival rather than simply being protected brought a sense of partnership that went beyond the immediate necessities of their flight. The trail was everything she'd promised, and worse, a narrow ledge carved into living rock by men desperate enough to risk their lives for the promise of gold. At one point, Kaya's horse stumbled on loose shale, its front legs sliding dangerously close to the edge before his firm hand on the reins, and Louisa's quick thinking saved them all from disaster. "Easy, girl," Kaya murmured to the mare, while Louisa positioned herself between the horse and the drop-off, using her own body as a barrier while he regained control. The trust implied in that gesture that she would risk her own life to support his efforts wasn't lost on either of them. But their most dangerous moment came when a freak sandstorm driven by hot winds from the desert to the south engulfed them just as they reached the relative safety of the creek bottom. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the stinging sand made it impossible to see or breathe properly. Worse, they could hear Malcolm's men closing in, using the storm as cover for their approach. Kaya made a decision that was both brilliant and terrifyingly risky. Using his knowledge of Apache tactics, he led them directly toward the sound of their pursuers, counting on the storm to mask their movement until they were close enough to strike. When they emerged from the swirling sand directly behind Malcolm's advanced scouts, the surprise was complete and devastating. The brief gunfight that followed was decided more by positioning than marksmanship, with Kaya and Louisa fighting back-to-back, while Amelie protected Adele behind a fallen cottonwood. But it was Louisa who made the crucial shot, dropping Malcolm's lieutenant just as he was drawing a bead on Kaya's injured leg. "Behind you!" She called out her warning, coming just in time for Kaya to roll aside, as another bandit's bullet sparked off the rock where his head had been moments before. The way she'd moved during the fight, the steadiness of her aim under pressure, the calm efficiency with which she'd reloaded and repositioned herself, all of it spoke to a kind of frontier competence that commanded respect regardless of gender or background. Kaya found himself revising his assessment of her capabilities, yet again recognizing that she was someone who could be counted on when circumstances turned deadly. The sandstorm that had nearly killed them also provided their salvation, allowing them to slip away, while their enemies were still trying to reorganize after the ambush. But the cost had been high, their water was running low, the horses were exhausted, and Kaya's leg wound had reopened during the fighting. That night, as they huddled together in the shelter of an overhanging rock formation, Louisa tended to his injury, while Adele slept curled against his uninjured side. The child's complete trust in the Apache warrior who'd become her protector spoke to something deeper than simple gratitude she'd found in him, and the kind of steady presence that every child needed, but few in this harsh country were fortunate enough to discover. The intimacy of the moment was undeniable. Two people who'd found themselves bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence. As Louisa cleaned the wound with gentle competence, Kaya found himself wondering how long it had been since anyone had tended his injuries with such care, such obvious concern for his well-being, rather than simple medical necessity. "Tell me about tracking," she said quietly, partly to distract him from the pain as she cleaned the wound, and partly from genuine curiosity about skills that might help them survive what lay ahead. Kaya's response was to take her hand and guide her fingers to barely visible signs in the earth around their camp. "Feel the edges," he instructed, his voice low enough not to carry beyond their small circle of safety. "Sharp means fresh. Rounded means old. This depression here that's from a shod horse, maybe 4 hours old, moving east toward the river." As her fingers traced the subtle contours under his guidance, Louisa became acutely aware of the calloused strength of his hands and the patient way he shared knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. When their fingers lingered together, longer than strictly necessary for the lesson, neither pulled away immediately. The moment stretched between them, filled with the kind of understanding that could only develop between people who'd proven themselves to each other under the worst possible circumstances. Louisa found herself thinking that she'd never felt this kind of partnership with Thomas, much as she'd loved her husband. This was something different, a meeting of equals who'd chosen to trust each other with their lives. "You learn quickly," he said, his voice carrying a note of approval that sent warmth spreading through her chest in a way that had nothing to do with their shared blanket. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls, not the random movement of wild horses, but the disciplined advance of riders who knew exactly where they were going. Malcolm had found their trail again, and this time he'd brought reinforcements. The final phase of their flight took them through country that grew increasingly hostile with each mile badlands, carved by ancient floods into a maze of arroyos and mesas, where water was scarce and shelter scarcer still. It was here that Amelie made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden in a played-out mine shaft that Charlie Brennan had told them about, she found evidence that transformed their understanding of the entire conspiracy. Not just ledger books documenting fraudulent transactions, but detailed maps showing the locations of mass graves scattered across 3 territories, along with correspondence that proved the systematic nature of Nathaniel Mallory's campaign of vengeance. "Look at this," she said, her voice tight with horror, as she examined a letter bearing Nathaniel's personal seal. "He's been planning this for 20 years. Every family that bore the Mallory name, every business connection your father had, every person who might have known the truth about your mother's choice, they're all targets." The letter was addressed to Malcolm, but its contents made clear that the gang leader was merely a tool in a much larger and more personal campaign of destruction. Nathaniel Mallory hadn't just ordered Owen's death. He'd been present at Devil's Gate, had personally supervised the ambush to ensure that his nephew suffered before dying. "The boy must know why he's dying." Louisa read aloud from the letter, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "He must understand that his family's sins have finally come due. Make sure he lives long enough to hear the truth about his precious mother and father." The revelation hit Louisa like a physical blow, but it also transformed her grief into something harder and more focused. The abstract desire for justice that had been driving her since Owen's disappearance crystallized into something personal and immediate. This wasn't just about stopping a criminal. This was about confronting the monster who destroyed her family out of spite for an old romantic disappointment. But their discovery had come at a cost. The time spent searching the mine had allowed Malcolm to close the distance between them. And when they emerged into the failing light of evening, they found themselves surrounded by armed men with no avenue of escape, except the one that led directly toward Devil's Gate Trestle, on the same bridge where Owen had died, and where Nathaniel Mallory now waited to complete his circle of vengeance. As they made their final approach to the bridge, Millie found herself riding beside Louisa, the 2 women united by their shared determination to see justice done despite the overwhelming odds they faced. "I'm scared," Amelie admitted quietly, her schoolteacher's honesty overcoming her desire to appear brave. "But I'm more angry than scared. All those families, all those children left orphaned by this madman's obsession with revenge." Louisa reached over to squeeze her friend's hand, drawing strength from the contact. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," she replied. "We're fighting for everyone who couldn't fight back, everyone who died without knowing why they were being targeted." The bond between them had grown stronger throughout their ordeal. 2 women who'd found in each other the kind of courage that comes from shared purpose and mutual support. Whatever happened at Devil's Gate, they would face it together. The approach to Devil's Gate took them through country that seemed designed by a malevolent god to maximize human suffering. The terrain was a maze of razor-sharp ridges and alkali flats, where nothing grew except thorny shrubs that could strip flesh from bone. The river itself ran black and swift between towering walls of red sandstone, its voice a constant whisper of mortality that seemed to mock their hopes of survival. As they crested the final ridge and saw the trestle bridge stretching across the chasm like a wooden challenge to gravity itself, Louisa felt her heart clench with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. This was where her brother had died, where the chain of murder and betrayal had begun. It was fitting in a terrible way that it should also be where that chain would finally be broken. But the scene spread out below them was far more complex than she'd anticipated. Malcolm's gang controlled the western approach to the bridge, and their rifles glinting in the late afternoon sun, as they prepared for what they clearly expected to be a final reckoning. Sheriff Kane's corrupted deputies held the eastern end, their badges gleaming with false authority, as they completed the trap that would ensure no witnesses survived to testify against their patron. Before they could fully process the tactical situation, a new voice cut through the desert air, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sheriff Kane was speaking to someone hidden behind a stand of cottonwoods, his tone servile in a way that spoke of fear rather than respect. "Everything's ready, mister." Mallory Kane was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Soon as they step onto that bridge, we'll have them trapped with nowhere to run. Just like you wanted." The response came in a cultured voice that carried no trace of frontier roughness, the accent of someone who'd been educated in Eastern schools and grown wealthy through methods that didn't require calloused hands or honest sweat. "Excellent, Sheriff. But remember, I want the woman and the Apache taken alive initially. There are certain things they need to understand before they die, certain debts that must be acknowledged before they're collected in full." Even without seeing the speaker, Louisa felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. She'd heard that voice before at family gatherings from her childhood, speaking words of false courtesy, while eyes burned with barely concealed resentment. And there in the center of the bridge itself stood a figure that made Louisa's blood freeze in her veins. Nathaniel Mallory had discarded the pretense of civilized distance, trading his elegant carriage for a horse and rifle, like some frontier warlord come to claim his domain. Even at this distance, she could see the cold satisfaction in his posture, as he surveyed the killing ground he'd so carefully prepared. The years had changed him, she realized with growing horror. The respectable businessman she remembered from childhood had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous, shaped by decades of nursing grievances until they'd consumed whatever humanity he'd once possessed. He's not content to watch from safety. Kaya observed his trained eye, cataloging the tactical situation with professional interest. He wants to be close enough to see your face when you realize there's no escape. But Louisa was studying the bridge itself, noting details that others might miss. The wooden structure was old and weathered its supporting timbers, showing the kind of stress fractures that spoke of deferred maintenance and structural weakness. More importantly, lightning from recent storms had kindled small fires along the riverbank, and now those flames were beginning to spread toward the trestle, with the hungry determination of something that had been waiting too long for fuel. "The bridge won't hold much longer," she said quietly, her mind already working through possibilities that ranged from desperate to suicidal. Those support beams were damaged in the spring floods, and now the fires weakening them further. "If we can time this right." She didn't finish the thought, but Kaya understood immediately. The bridge that had been intended as their execution ground might also be the key to their salvation, if they had the courage to risk everything on a gamble that could easily kill them all. As they prepared for what might be their final battle, Adele tugged on Kaya's sleeve with the innocent curiosity that only children could maintain in the face of mortal danger. "Kaya," she said quietly, her young voice carrying a wisdom that went far beyond her years. "Why do some people choose to be so mean when they could choose to be kind instead? The question struck at the heart of everything they'd experienced during their desperate flight. And Kaya found himself considering how to answer in a way that would preserve her faith in the possibility of goodness, while acknowledging the reality of human evil. Sometimes people get hurt so badly that they forget how to heal. He said finally, his scarred hands gentle as he adjusted the guitar strap across his back. Instead of letting their wounds make them kinder to others who are hurting, they let the pain turn into something poisonous that spreads to everyone around them. Adele nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her 8-year-old understanding of the world's complexities. Like Uncle Nathaniel. The casual way she spoke the name, as if Nathaniel Mallory was simply another adult whose behavior needed to be understood, rather than a monster who'd orchestrated the deaths of countless innocents, reminded them all of what they were fighting to protect. Not just their own lives, but the kind of future where children could still ask honest questions and expect honest answers. The first phase of the battle began with a carefully orchestrated deception. Using Emily's knowledge of legal procedures and Adele's small size, they managed to create the illusion that they were approaching under a flag of truce, carrying documents that Nathaniel would want to examine personally before ordering their deaths. The ruse worked just long enough to get them onto the bridge itself, where the true nature of the trap became clear. This wasn't just about eliminating witnesses. It was about giving Nathaniel Mallory the personal satisfaction of destroying his brother's family with his own hands. 23 years. He said, his voice carrying clearly across the wooden planks as they faced each other in the center of the span. 23 years I've waited for this moment. Your father stole everything from me, my inheritance, my business, my future wife. And when I finally found a way to make him pay, the coward died of fever before I could show him the true cost of his betrayal. The pistol in his hand was steady despite his age, and his eyes held the kind of cold certainty that came from a lifetime of nursing grievances until they became indistinguishable from righteousness. As Louisa looked into those familiar features, twisted now by decades of hatred into something barely recognizable as human, she felt the last of her childhood illusions crumble into dust. But his children will pay that debt in full. Nathaniel continued, his gaze fixed on Louisa, with the intensity of obsession finally given free rein. Starting with the boy who thought he could build something better than what I'd created. I made sure Owen knew exactly why he was dying, made sure he understood that his precious family's sins had finally come due. The confession hit Louisa like a physical blow, but it also completed the transformation that had been building throughout their desperate flight. The grief that had been eating at her since Owen's letters stopped coming crystallized into something harder and more focused, not just the desire for justice, but the iron determination to ensure that this monster would never again have the opportunity to destroy innocent lives in service of his twisted obsessions. You killed him yourself. She said the words carrying absolute certainty. You weren't content to hire others to do it. You had to be there, had to watch, had to. Nathaniel's smile was the coldest thing she'd ever seen, devoid of warmth or humanity or anything resembling normal emotion. The expression transformed his face into something that belonged in nightmares rather than family memories. I held the knife that opened his throat. He replied without shame or regret. Just as I'm going to hold the gun that ends your miserable existence. But first, you're going to watch me kill the Apache and the child so you can experience the same helplessness your brother felt in his final moments. But Nathaniel had made the same mistake that had doomed so many others in this brutal country. He'd underestimated the people he was trying to destroy. Kaya had been moving during the villain's speech, using the distraction to position himself for a strike that would disrupt the carefully planned execution. His thoughts were focused not on his own survival, but on the promise he'd made to a dying man. and the new promise that had grown from it to protect this woman and child who'd become more important to him than his own life. Amelie had taken advantage of her schoolteacher's training to memorize every word of Nathaniel's confession, ensuring that his crimes would be documented even if none of them survived to testify. And Louisa had been studying the bridge's structure, noting the way the ancient timbers groaned under the weight of armed men, and the heat as fires spread along the riverbank below. The second phase erupted when Nathaniel raised his pistol toward Adele, his intention clear despite the tactical disadvantage it would create. But Louisa was already in motion, her own weapon clearing leather, with the speed of someone who'd learned that hesitation meant death in this country, where mercy was a luxury that few could afford. Her first shot took Nathaniel in the shoulder, spinning him around and spoiling his aim, just as Kaya tackled Malcolm from behind with the silent grace of a hunting cat. The bridge suddenly erupted into chaos, as men on both ends realized that their carefully planned execution had become a three-way battle for survival. Sheriff Kane's deputies opened fire from the eastern approach, their bullets whining overhead as they tried to eliminate witnesses to their patron's crimes. Malcolm's gang responded from the western end, and their rifles adding to the deadly crossfire that turned the bridge into a shooting gallery, where cover was non-existent and death could come from any direction. But it was the third phase that transformed the battle from a tactical engagement into something resembling a natural disaster. The fires that had been smoldering along the riverbank finally reached the bridge's wooden supports, and suddenly the entire structure was ablaze with flames that turned the air itself into a shimmering curtain of blistering heat. The fourth and most dangerous phase began when the trestle's ancient timbers, weakened by decades of weather, and now thoroughly consumed by fire, began to give way beneath the weight of armed men and the stress of combat. The wooden structure groaned and swayed with each exchange of gunfire, and everyone fighting on the bridge suddenly realized that their battlefield was becoming a death trap that would claim victims regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. It was during this moment of mutual peril that the true character of each combatant was revealed. Malcolm's men began abandoning their positions, more concerned with personal survival than completing their mission. Sheriff Kane's deputies showed similar cowardice, retreating toward solid ground as soon as the danger became personal rather than professional. But Nathaniel Mallory refused to retreat, his obsession with revenge overriding even his instinct for self-preservation. With blood streaming from his wounded shoulder and flames licking at his expensive boots, he continued his assault on the family he blamed for every disappointment his life had contained. 23 years. He screamed above the roar of the fire and the groaning of failing timbers. 23 years of waiting, and I won't be cheated now by a collapsing bridge and a woman who thinks she can defy her betters. His second shot went wild as the bridge lurched beneath his feet, the bullet sparking off an iron bracket instead of finding Louisa's heart. But his third attempt might have succeeded if Kaya hadn't thrown himself between them, taking the bullet in his already wounded leg and sending him crashing to the burning planks with a grunt of pain. As Kaya fell, his thoughts weren't on his own injury, but on the realization that protecting Louisa and Adele had become as sacred to him as his original promise to Owen. The dying man's request had brought him to this place, but his own choice had made their survival his responsibility. That's when Louisa understood that this was her moment, her choice, her responsibility. Not Kaya's fight or Amelie's investigation or anyone else's quest for justice. This was about her family, her brother, her duty to ensure that Owen's death meant something more than the satisfaction of a madman's twisted revenge. The weight of all those lost years, all the words left unspoken between herself and Owen, all the guilt she'd carried for their final argument, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. She advanced on Nathaniel with the deliberate stride of someone who'd finally found the courage to face the thing she feared most. "You want to know about betrayal?" she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos surrounding them. Try living with the knowledge that your own uncle murdered your brother out of spite for something that happened before either of us was born. Her shot took Nathaniel in the chest, the impact sending him staggering backward toward the edge of the collapsing span. But even mortally wounded, his hatred gave him strength for one final gesture of malice. "If I can't have my revenge," he gasped, blood frothing from his lips, as he raised his pistol toward Adele with the last of his failing strength, "then I'll settle for making sure you know what loss feels like." That's when Louisa proved that she was indeed her father's daughter, and her brother's sister, possessed of the same courage and determination that had made the Mallory name respected throughout the territory before Nathaniel's jealousy had poisoned it with blood. She launched herself at her uncle with complete disregard for her own safety, striking him with her shoulder just as his final shot went wide. The impact sent both of them sliding toward the edge of the burning span. But Louisa managed to catch herself on a broken railing while Nathaniel tumbled into the black water below with a splash that was lost in the roar of flames and collapsing timber. The bridge's final collapse was both spectacular and terrifying, and the entire structure folding in on itself like a house of cards touched by a child's careless hand. But Kaya had used those precious seconds to reach both Adele and Amelie, gathering them close to the span's one remaining support beam as the rest of the trestle disintegrated around them. Louisa found herself clinging to a piece of burning wreckage as the current carried her downstream. Up in the icy water, a shocking contrast to the furnace heat that had surrounded them on the bridge. But strong hands caught her before the river could claim her, hauling her to safety on a sandbar, where Charlie Brennan and several other miners had been waiting with ropes and the kind of frontier determination that turned ordinary men into heroes when circumstances demanded it. "Got here as soon as we could," Charlie explained, his weathered face creased with concern as he checked her for injuries. "Amelie's schoolhouse friend managed to get word to us about what was happening. Figured you might need some backup when the shooting started." One of the younger miners, a man named Tom Whitfield, whose own farm had been burned out by Malcolm's gang the previous spring, added his own motivation for joining the rescue effort. "Mallory's people killed my brother when he tried to fight the eviction order," he said simply. "This was personal for all of us." The aftermath was a confusion of rescue efforts and medical treatment, with Dr. Huxley arriving from Prairie Rose to tend wounds and assess damage. But the most important healing was of a different sort entirely. The knowledge that justice had finally been served, and that the cycle of violence that had begun with Nathaniel's jealousy was finally broken. Kaya's leg wound was serious, but not fatal, the bullet having missed major blood vessels by mere fractions of an inch. As Dr. Huxley worked to clean and dress the injury, the old physician found himself impressed by the Apache warrior's stoic endurance and the obvious care that Louisa showed in assisting with the medical treatment. "You've got good hands for this kind of work," he told her quietly as she helped him suture the wound. "Ever think about learning more formal medicine? This territory could use another skilled healer." Adele was physically unharmed, but would carry the memory of that terrible day for the rest of her life. A burden that Louisa was determined to help her bear with love and patience and honest answers to difficult questions. As they sat together by the doctor's campfire that evening, the child asked the question that had been weighing on her mind since the battle ended. "Is it wrong that I'm not sad Uncle Nathaniel died?" She said quietly, her young voice carrying a wisdom that went far beyond her years. Louisa considered the question carefully before answering, recognizing the importance of giving an honest response that would help shape the child's understanding of justice and morality. It's not wrong to feel relief when someone who was hurting innocent people can't hurt anyone anymore, she said finally. But it is sad that he chose to let his anger turn him into someone so different from the person he could have been. Amelie's evidence survived the bridge's destruction, her oilcloth-wrapped satchel protecting the documents that would allow territorial authorities to dismantle the entire network of corruption that had operated with impunity for so many years. Sheriff Kane and his surviving deputies were arrested by federal marshals, who arrived within days of receiving her carefully documented reports. But perhaps the most important discovery came from Nathaniel's body recovered from the river, along with a leather portfolio that contained correspondence dating back more than 2 decades. The letters revealed the full scope of his obsession, naming other targets and detailing crimes that had never been connected to his legitimate business operations. 23 families, Dr. Huxley said quietly as he reviewed the evidence in his clinic, his medical training making him sensitive to the human cost of such systematic violence. 23 families that he targeted for destruction, all because they had some connection to your parents or their business interests. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering, but so was the relief that came with finally understanding the truth. Owen's death hadn't been random or meaningless. It had been the culmination of a lifetime of hatred that had consumed its host as thoroughly as any disease. In the days that followed, as Prairie Rose began the slow process of healing from years of corruption and violence, relationships that had been forged in crisis began to evolve into something deeper and more enduring. Kaya's leg mended slowly, but completely aided by Dr. Huxley's medical skill and Louisa's patient care. The intimacy that had developed between them during their desperate flight didn't fade with the return of safety. Instead, it grew stronger as they discovered that partnership in crisis could become partnership in peace. The guitar that had carried them through so much danger was damaged but not destroyed its scarred wood, and loosened strings serving as tangible reminders of promises kept and prices paid. When Kaya played it in the evenings, sitting on the clinic steps with Adele curled against his side, the music seemed to speak of loss and hope in equal measure. Owen would be proud, Louisa said one evening, as she listened to a melody her brother had composed years earlier, its notes carrying across the prairie like a prayer for the dead and a blessing for the living. He is proud, Kaya replied, his fingers finding harmonies that transformed the simple tune into something more complex and beautiful. The dead rest easier when their promises are kept and their debts are paid in full. The romance that had bloomed between survival necessity and shared danger now faced the more complex challenge of peacetime decisions and social expectations. But the bonds forged in fire proved stronger than the artificial barriers that society tried to construct around them. When the territorial governor offered Kaya a position as special deputy charged with investigating crimes that crossed cultural boundaries, both of them understood that it represented not just professional advancement, but the opportunity to build something new and lasting. The work would keep me in this area, he explained, his hands gentle as they rewrapped her injured wrist with clean bandages. Close enough to help with the harvest, far enough to avoid causing talk that might hurt your reputation or Adele's prospects. But Louisa had learned too much about courage and conviction to worry about the opinions of people who measured worth by convention rather than character. Let them talk, she said, her fingers intertwining with his as they both held the bandage in place. We've got more important things to build than reputations based on other people's fears. The future they planned together was practical rather than romantic, rooted in shared values and mutual respect rather than grand gestures or dramatic declarations. They would work the land that Owen had never seen, raise the child who'd lost her parents to the same fever that had claimed Thomas, and create something good from the ashes of so much tragedy. Charlie Brennan, his shoulder healed and his conscience finally clear, became their first partner in this endeavor. His knowledge of mining and irrigation would prove invaluable in developing the water sources that could transform marginal land into productive farmland. Amelie, appointed as the territory's first official recorder of deeds, would ensure that property rights were protected by law rather than corrupted by influence. Dr. Huxley expanded his practice to include regular visits to the Apache camps, finding that traditional healing methods often complemented his formal medical training in ways that benefited patients from both cultures. The bridge between peoples that had seemed impossible just months earlier was becoming a reality built on mutual need and growing respect. But perhaps the most important change was in Adele herself, who'd survived trauma that would have broken many adults and emerged with a wisdom that went far beyond her years. She divided her time between helping Louisa with farm work and learning Apache customs from Kaya, becoming a living symbol of the cooperation that could flourish when fear gave way to understanding. On the first anniversary of Owen's death, they held a memorial service at the site where Devil's Gate Trestle had once spanned the river. A new bridge was being built there, stronger and safer than its predecessor, designed to carry commerce and communication rather than serving as a trap for the unwary. Kaya played Owen's guitar, while Louisa read from the letter her brother had written during his final moments, his words speaking across death itself to reassure the living that love and hope could survive even the worst that human malice could devise. When the service ended, they released wildflowers into the current, watching them drift downstream like prayers made visible. "He's free now," Adele said, her young voice carrying absolute certainty. "He doesn't have to worry about us anymore because we're safe and we're together and we remember him the right way." As the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered Kaya's people for countless generations, the four adults who'd become a family through choice rather than blood stood together at the river's edge. The guitar hummed softly in the evening breeze, its damaged strings producing harmonies that spoke of healing and hope, and the music that could be made when different voices learned to sing together. The territory stretched endlessly around them, harsh and beautiful, and no longer quite so dangerous now that justice meant something more than the highest bidder's interpretation of law. There would be other challenges, other threats, other tests of the bonds they'd forged in fire and sealed with shared sacrifice. But they would face those trials together as partners and allies and friends who'd learned that the strongest foundations were built not on blood or tradition, but on the conscious choice to protect and support each other regardless of the cost. The future spread before them like an unmapped territory full of possibilities, and they were ready to explore it together. Note by carefully crafted note, seasoned by patient seasoned promise, by sacred promise kept in full.